Hey everyone, welcome back to another Angular tutorial. In our previous videos, we have set up NgRx for managing task state and even our user authentication state. But what happens when our state changes need to interact with the outside world, like fetching data from a server or saving to a local storage or triggering other asynchronous operations? That's where NgRx effect come into play. So in this video, we'll dive into handling the side effects the NgRx way. So we'll learn what side effects are in the context of state management and why can't we just use reducers to handle them. So we will start by implementing a practical example which will be fetching our initial task list from a real mock API, okay? So what we will do is we will use a JSON placeholder mock API to get the data whenever our application load. So by the end of this video, you will understand the role of NgRx effects and how to use them to integrate asynchronous operations into your NgRx workflow. So what exactly is a side effect in our NgRx world? Think of it as an interaction our application has with the outside world. So some common examples are making an HTTP request. So whenever we make an HTTP request to an API, whenever we want to fetch the data or we want to save the data, we use NgRx effect. Or if we are interacting with our browser storage, for example, using local storage or session storage to save some user profile or data. So now the question arises, why can't we just put our API call directly in our reducer? But we can't do that because if you should remember, the core principle of NgRx is that in our reducer, they can only be a pure function, which means the only job of the reducer is to take the input and produce the same output as they have got, okay? So this purity makes our reducer so predictable, right? Which makes it easy to test and also helps us to do debugging and all of the other stuff. But if we try to put a asynchronous API call in our reducer, this would break the whole purity of our reducer, okay? And it would create 100 different problems. So where do we handle these side effects? That's where our NgRx effects come into place. So NgRx effects are services in Angular that listens for some specific action dispatched to the store. So whenever an action they are interested in and that action is occurred, then we can perform some specific tasks like calling an API or dispatching new actions based on the response we are getting. For example, if we get a success response from a data, okay, or we get a failure response with an error, then we can send those kind of actions and we can perform our task like that. So the typical flow of an NgRx store using an effect would look like this. So a component which dispatches an action, for example, our loadTask API, okay? And there will be an effect which will be listening to this specific action. And this effect will trigger our side effect, which is to call the API, okay? And once the side effect is completed, like the API, from there, if we get a success or we get an error, and then this effect will dispatch a new action based on whatever result we got. Like if it's a success from our API, then we will load like loadTasksSuccess, okay? Or if it's a failure, then we'll load loadTasksFailure. So both of the action we can dispatch accordingly, and on based on that action, our reducer will update our state accordingly. Sounds easy, right? So this keeps our component focused on dispatching initial actions, okay, and selecting those states, and helps our reducer to purely focused on state transition. And then our effects, basically, they take care of all the side effects. Okay, let's make our task list more realistic. Instead of starting with an empty array defined in our initial task state, we will fetch the initial list of tasks from our JSON placeholder mock API, okay, from here. So whenever our app loads, we will have some predefined task already in our component, okay. So first thing we need to do is we need to install NgRx effect package, okay. So inside our terminal here, we will install our NgRx effect package. So this will install NgRx effect into our project, okay. It's been installed. Okay, so now we have NgRx effect installed in our project. So next thing, since we'll be dealing with real HTTP request, we should have Angular HttpClientModule and our effects module in our app.module.ts file. So if we go here to app.module.ts file, inside this, to use HttpClientModule, first we need to import it, okay? So we'll say import client module, okay? And we'll import it from our Angular commons. So we'll say /common and HTTP. Okay, now we can use this HTTP client module inside our import. So we need to import it and we'll write it here. And now we can use our HTTP client module. And this is really essential as we will be dealing with real HTTP request. Now we also need to register our effects module as well. So after this, we will also register our effects. Okay, so we'll say effects module dot for root. So on the global root level, we are registering our effects file, which we will create in a bit. So inside this, we will have our task effects. So we will create a class called task effect, which will have all of our effects. Okay, so like this task effects. Okay. So for better understanding, we will start with our core pieces, which are, we will update our actions, our reducer and our effects. Okay, so we can communicate with the real API call. So in our actions file here, these actions remain the same. Okay, we just need to create new actions to represent the loading process. For example, whenever we are starting to load the application, our success and our failure. Okay, so what we will do is first we will create our loading here. So for loading, we can, so whenever our application is loading on ng on init, we need to create an action, right, which we will call. So we'll say export constant load task. So load task, and we'll say it create action. Okay, as usual. And inside this, we will have our basic syntax. So inside the arrow bracket, we'll say our task. What it does is task API, and the event, which is load task. Okay. So this is our basic action to load. Okay, we don't need any props here. So after this, we will have our another action, which will be whenever our load task is success. So whenever we get a response from our effect that our loading of API is successful, we want to load a success action. So for that, we will call export constant load task success. Okay, and inside this we'll say create action, and here we will say task API load task success. Okay, and here we need to pass some props, which is our payload basically, which is our task which we are getting as a API request. Okay, so we are getting task here as a response from our API, and this will be of type task array. Okay, so this is the payload which contains the fetch task. Okay, now same we will have our errors. So if our API gives us an error, then we need to have error as well, right? So that would be load task failure. Okay, so like this, we will have a similar one for our load task failure. So this is like load task failure, and here the props we are carrying are the error which we get from our API. Okay, so we'll store those error and we'll pass it. Okay, so now for all three of these actions, we need to create our reducers. So now we need to update our state and our reducer. So if we go in our taskstate.ts file, we need to change our state now. So it would have now two more variables, which would be loading and error. So we'll have a loading boolean variable basically. This will allow us to track if the tasks are currently being loaded or no, right? If we are getting a request from an API, we want to know, okay, it's still being loaded, right? And if it's been loaded, then we want to tell, okay, it's not loaded now. And we also need to have an error property, and that can be of type any. So like this, we will have these two extra properties in our task state. And here we will define them for the initial state. So loading would be false in the beginning, okay, because initially we are not loading anything. And our error would be null because initially we don't have any error. So now we have defined our task state. Okay, now we need to go into our reducer file and define our reducers. So our reducer logic for our adding, removing and toggle stays same. We just need to add new reducers. So we will handle our other actions. So which would be first one would be our load task. Whenever our task action is loaded, we need to change our state. So we'll say on, here we'll say load task action. Okay, this one. And whenever this is called, we want to call our state. Okay, we will take the state. Okay, and we will update other properties. One of them is our loading property. So whenever load task action is called, we want to set our loading as true because we are loading, right, the data. And our error would be null because at this time we don't know if any error exists. And every time our load task is called, we want to clear our error. Okay, so we'll make it null. Okay, now we will handle our on load task success action. Okay, so this action is called whenever our API gets a success response. That time we want to load this action and update our state. So we will say on load task success, we want to take the state. Okay, and this time we will be getting our task list. Okay, the fetch task list. So we'll take the tasks here, and and we will open our arrow bracket here, and inside this we will say, we will take our previous state, okay, and we will update the properties. So our task, you see it, the state we have here, initial state, we have the task, right? So we will update it with the task we got. So we will take it and we will put it. And the other properties we can update is loading. Now we know we got the response from the API, so we are not loading anymore, so we'll make it false, okay, and our error would be null because no errors. Okay, so now last thing we need to do is our on load task failure. So in a scenario where our API gives us a 404 or any kind of request where it couldn't load the task, so we need to load our task failure. Okay, in that case we will do the same, take our state, and this time we will have our error here, okay, which we have passed through our actions. So we'll open our arrow bracket here, same way, and inside this we will again iterate our state and we will change the properties. So our loading property this time we will change is false because obviously we have finished with loading, and in the error property here we will store the errors object. Okay, so that is it. The only thing is we have got an error here on our task reducer. So we'll go to the action and we will see. Okay, so we can see we have got an error here. We just need to put the brackets here and this error should be solved. Now if we go to our reducer, we are done with all of our reducers which are working properly. Now we can go to the most important step of this tutorial, which is to create our effects file so we can deal with our HTTP client. Okay, so inside our task store we will create our task effect file. So I'll say here it would be task.effects.ts, and inside this we will create all of our effects. Okay, so we will define our class as task effect, so we'll call it task effects. Okay, and inside this we will define our constructor. So in order to use our API call and also our actions, we need to inject both of those here. So we will say inside the constructor we need to have our API, so we'll say private HTTP, which will come from HttpClient, and we also need to import our action, so we'll say private actions $, and this will be coming from our NgRx store, so NgRx effect. So we'll say actions and we'll open this, and we need to put our class as injectable. So after this we are ready to go. Okay, like this. Okay, so we can start writing our effect, which is load task. So this effect will get called every time our load task action is called. Okay, so we'll say load task equals to create effect, and inside this we will have our arrow bracket, and here we will say this dot actions. So we want to only call this effect whenever a particular action is triggered. So we'll say this dot actions dot pipe. We'll use pipe as we want to perform certain actions inside our effect. So to change them we can use pipe. So we'll put dot pipe, and inside this we only want it to call, like we only want this effect to trigger whenever our particular action is triggered, which is our load task actions, right? This one. So this effect will only listen to this specific action. So for that we will say of type. So what type of action do we want to listen to? So I want to listen to my load task, right? So I'll say load task. Okay, so you can see this load task, this action from here we're getting it from task.action, and after this we will call our switch map, and inside the switch map we will return our HTTP request. So we'll call our HTTP request and we will do the main logic inside this. So here we will make our actual HTTP get request. Okay, so the get request which we'll make to the JSONPlaceholder API, that will return us a data in the format of this, where we'll have a user ID, title ID, and a completed property. But if you remember, in our task.model we only have like these three properties, so we need to do a data transformation. Whenever we get a data from our this request, HTTP request, we need to convert this data to this data, and then we can show it in our UI. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So for that we need to define a structure of our JSONPlaceholder API. Okay, so for our response item we are getting this, we need to make a structure, right, to take this data and then we can convert it. So for that I'll create an interface here for our this backend data we are getting, right? So I'll say interface, it would be for JSON data. Okay, and here what I'll do is I will define all these properties, so all of these properties, So here what I've done is I've taken the user ID, title and completed property, and user ID, as it's a number, I've given it a type number. This is type string and this is type boolean. So I have given all these properties here. Okay. Now we can return our request in this format, and then we can do data transformation, okay, and convert it to our task.model. So we are doing this because we have two different kind of data here which we have to deal with. So here inside the switch map, we can make our request. So we'll say return this dot http, okay, and we'll do a get request. So this dot http dot get, and this will be of type JSON data, okay. So the data which get, it should be of type JSON data, and it would be of type array, because it won't be one specific object, it would be array of object. So we'll put JSON data array here, okay, and inside this we'll pass the URL from where we are getting the data. So it's this specific URL. So I'll copy this from here and I'll paste this. So it will make a request to this and it will return data in this format. So for that I will do pipe here, and inside pipe we will write all the cases which can happen. So one of the cases which can happen is our HTTP request, okay, it's a successful request, okay, or it's a failure request, right? Only two of the things can happen, either it's a success or it's a failure. So what I'll do is inside the pipe here I will say map, okay, as I want to go over all the data which we are getting from the backend, right? So I'll say map, and whatever data we are getting, for example backend data, what I'll do, I will go over it, okay. Now I'll convert all the data we are getting to our API response which we want. Okay, so the data which we are getting, this data is in this format and we want to convert it to our this format, right? So now we can do the data transformation inside this map, as it will go over all of the objects. So we'll say constant task here, and this would be of type, we want it to type task array, right? So we'll say task array equals to, we want to go over it, so we'll say backend data dot map, okay. So this will allow to loop over all the tasks, and we'll say to do task, okay. So we'll open it, and inside it here we will open object, and inside this we can define our properties. So we have all the properties. One is ID, and we want to give ID as this to do dot ID, okay, and it will be a number but we need to convert it to a string. So we'll say to do dot string, and then we have other property which is our description property. So description, in this case we are getting title, right? You can see this title we are going to give as description. So I will say to do dot title, okay, and it's already a string, so no need to convert. And at the end we have completed property, which is to do dot completed, we are getting from here, this one, and we don't care about the user ID property at that point, so we'll leave it out. And now after this, so this is our case which is handled where our actually the request is successful, right? And what we'll do is after this we'll close this, and after this map, once we have transformed our backend data, we can dispatch our success action. So we can say return, and we have our load success action. So we can say load task success. So this action, you can see load task success, this action we will trigger, and we will trigger it with our new task response which we are getting from the backend, right? This one which we have again transformed. So we'll pass our task property as this task. So the new tasks which we got, all of them which are transferred now coming from the real HTTP request, okay. But if this is not the case, then after this we will say that, and remember this only gets called if there is error. So here we'll say catch error, and this catch error will only get called if there is actually error. So if there is an error, then we want to return this time our load task failure. So we'll say load task failure, and we want to send our error property this time. So we'll say error, and we will send the error whatever object we get from our HTTP request, which could be a 404 or any kind of error we receive. Okay, and here in catch error we need to return observable, so we'll use off, okay, and we will put this inside this off. So we'll take it and put it inside this, and you'll see it will solve our error too. And that's it, we can end our create effect here. So we have written our first effect, which is load task, okay. So we have handled both of the cases. One is whenever our HTTP request, okay, if it fails, and one where our HTTP request doesn't fail. So now this action will pass the new updated task state, and reducer will update it, and we can select the new updated state from our selector and update our components. So I hope you understood this load task effect which we have created. If you didn't understand, then let me know in the comments. Now we will go to the final part, which is to get this data in our component file. So we'll go to app component.ts file. So most of the part remains same inside this. What we will do is we will implement our ng on init and we will put our code inside that. Okay, so we'll say ng on init here. So on init, okay, and we will declare our ng on init method. So ng on init, okay, and we can take all the code inside this. So here we'll put it. Okay, now we just need to put like a indefinite sign here in both of these variables as they can be undefined. Okay, so now inside our ng on init, only thing we need to do is, okay, so you'll see if I go to our application right now and if we try to log in here, okay, you'll see there's no data and we're not getting any data from here, right? Because we need to load the data, right? So for that, inside our ng on init, whenever application is loaded, we need to dispatch our load task. So what we will do is we will say this dot store dot dispatch, and what action we want to dispatch here? Our load task action, right? So we'll say load task action, and once this action is dispatched from here, what will happen is I'll show you the process. So as soon as our component is loaded, ng on init is called, and inside this store.dispatch is called. So it calls the load task action, okay? And because of this action, our effect, this will get triggered, okay, whenever this action is gonna get called, and it will do all of the data fetching, and then it will give us a success or a failure response depending on our API as it's working. As you can see, we should get a success response, and as soon as we get that, it will return us a load task success. So as soon as we return a load task success with this, it will update the reducer, okay, here inside it will pass this task property, it will update the reducer here with the task, it will make the loading as false, so we'll be able to load our UI because we will design it in a way, and then from our selector we should be able to get the updated state. Okay, so if you go to our app component, now we just need to define our other observables. Okay, so as you know, we had two more properties in our task state, right? One of which was loading and error, so we will also be defining it here. So we'll say task loading, okay, and it's observable, and task loading basically it's a true or false, right? So observable of type boolean here, okay, and we will have another one which would be our task error. So by any chance if there are errors in our API response, then we need to display those errors, right, or tell user that there is an error. So for that we'll have another observable, and that would be of type any because we don't know what kind of errors would be. And for this we will just give them like a indefinite sign here like this, and this is short, and this should solve our errors. Now what we need to do is we need to have two selectors so we can get those states as well, right, updated states. So for that we will go into our task.selector.ts file, and here you can just copy these as I've already created those. Okay, so these are basics how we take our state. So select task state and we are getting state.loading, and for our error we are selecting the task state as usual, we are taking the task state and getting our error property here. Okay, how we do for our task, so we take all the task here, okay, select task, and we get state.task, easy. So now if you go back to our app component inside our ng on init, how we are loading all of the other observables, we need to load those two observables too. So these two, task loading and task error. So that's actually it for all of our code. But if you want, you can have some more conditions using our this.task loading and this.task error, and only show user the list whenever both of these are false, like it shouldn't be loading and there shouldn't be any error, then only we can show the task. So you can do that if you want, but for this tutorial I will directly show you how our code works. So if I go here into our application and if I refresh it and if I try to log in this time, it shouldn't be an empty list. Okay, so you see now we have got all of our list here already there. So all of the data, it's coming from our JSONPlaceholder API. You can see all of this. Okay, and we can do whatever we want with this data. We can save it like this, okay, and we can take here, now we can add a new task too, okay, or we can delete a task like this. If we log out and if we try to log in back, okay, you will see that we have our same updated task list as it was. So you see the state has been maintained and we have got the same data. So that is the power of NgRx, and especially when it's combined with effect, you can deal with side effects like handling an API, what we did right now. So that's all for today's video. If you guys found this video helpful, then please like, comment and subscribe. I will see you guys in the next video.